From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm very happy today to introduce our speaker, the writer Chris Van Dusen, who in my household is known as the guy who draws that cool pig and that awesome car that is also a boat where you can get shakes and cheeseburgers. He's been a writer and illustrator of many acclaimed children's books, including Kate DeMillo's Mercy Watson series. Known for his jaunty rhyming couplets and his bright retro cartoon-like drawings, Van Dusen has written and illustrated books such as A Camping Spree with Mr. McGee, If I Built a Car, and The Circus Ship, which has been selected to represent the state of Maine at the Pavilion of States here at the festival. State of Maine. He is also one of the illustrators of the Exquisite Corpse Adventure, an original story written for the Library of Congress's website, which is now a book. His new book is called King Hugo's Huge Ego, and it's a very wry love story about a little king with an outsized ego who simultaneously gets his comeuppance and the girl. Van Dusen lives in Maine with his family, including a dog who is not named Dee, and he says that he is not Mr. McGee, but he can tell you more about who he is. So here is Chris Van Dusen.
Thanks very much. Good job. Well, hello. First of all, I just want to say, if you think you're here to hear the guy who wrote the Polar Express, that's the wrong Chris Van. So you may want to leave now if you're disappointed. I'll wait briefly. Good job. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me here today. I'm so thrilled to be here. I usually go around and I talk to kids at schools and libraries, and so I'm usually surrounded on the floor by these little 4- and 5-year-olds. So just looking out at all you people today sitting so upright in your chairs, you actually look quite big to me, and it's a little intimidating, but I am thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled that you came out today. My name is Chris Van Dusen. I live in this great state of Maine, and I describe myself as an illustrator, author of children's picture books. Now, most people describe themselves as an author, illustrator, but I switch it around because I actually started out as an illustrator. I started illustrating back in 1988, freelance illustrating. Before that, I worked for a magazine. I was an art director for a magazine that went belly up. And then I worked for a greeting card company in the state of Maine, a small independent greeting card company, and I did some illustrations for that as well. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Okay. Now, but I went out on my own in 1988, and when I first started illustrating, freelance illustrating, I took any job that came my way because I was hungry and I had to pay the bills. So I remember one of my first jobs illustrating was I did swing set instructions. And there was a company that is near where I live in Maine, and they make these big wooden swing sets. So I went to their office, and they gave me all these giant pieces of cedar, which I lugged back to my house, and I lugged upstairs to the little back bedroom that I was using as a studio. I laid them on the floor, and I thought, how am I going to make these look like they go together? And so my illustration career didn't start in the most glamorous way. But after a while, I eventually did more and more illustrations, and I got to a point where I realized what I really enjoyed doing, as far as illustration goes, is I really enjoyed doing editorial work, which is magazine work, and I really like doing work for kids' magazines in specific. So I did a lot of illustrations for magazines like Nickelodeon Magazine and Disney Adventures and Family Fun. And I had a lot of fun doing that. That was a really, really good time. But I noticed that a lot of my peers at the time, other people who were editorial illustrators, I'm going to get to those in just a second. I noticed they were doing something that looked like a lot of fun to me. They were writing and illustrating children's books. And so I came up with an idea for a book. I thought I'd give it a shot too. And I came up with an idea for a book, and after 9 years of working on it, because I was sort of doing it in my spare time while I was doing editorial illustration, I came up with my first book, and it's called Down to the Sea with Mr. McGee. You guys actually know this book? Some of you? Wow. This came out in the year 2000. It was published by Chronicle Books. I was both the author and illustrator of this book. And when this book came out, I'd go around to libraries and schools in Maine, and I'd talk to the kids. And a lot of kids would ask me afterwards, they'd say, "What's your next Mr. McGee book going to be?" Now, I wasn't even sure I was going to write another book, let alone a Mr. McGee book. But so many kids asked me if I was going to write another Mr. McGee book that my second book was also about Mr. McGee, and that's called A Camping Spree with Mr. McGee. That's this one right here. I'm going to line them up on the stage, by the way. Now, after A Camping Spree with Mr. McGee came out, I didn't want to just do Mr. McGee books for the rest of my life, although that wouldn't be so bad either. But I wanted to branch out a little bit, and so my third book that I wrote and illustrated, which came out in the year 2005, was a little bit different for me. It's called If I Built a Car. And it's not about Mr. McGee, although I decided to put Mr. McGee in one of the illustrations. And I just sort of took a risk. I thought, well, I'll just stick him in there. I've got a guy in a boat. I'll just put him in the picture. And now every time I read this book, when I get to that page, kids go, "There's Mr. McGee!" So they really like spotting him. And since then, he's sort of become this reoccurring sort of, Alfred Hitchcock type character that sort of appears cameo throughout the book. And he's even in books where he does not belong at all. So we'll get to those in just a second. Now, 2005 was a busy year for me because not only did If I Built a Car come out, but I got an offer from Candlewick Press to illustrate stories for an author that was not very well known. She was kind of struggling, Nobody'd really heard of her. Her name was Kate DiCamillo, which of course is a major understatement because she's a rock star. And she wrote these books about a pig named Mercy Watson. And this is the first book in this series. Now, I got this job. It was kind of funny how I got this job. There's an art director at Candlewick Press, and I learned this afterwards, by the way, named Anne. And Anne and I have become good friends. We've worked on a lot of books together. But apparently, Anne had bought the Mr. McGee books. And she really liked the illustrations in the Mr. McGee books. And so she would bring them to every editorial meeting, when she was trying to find a project for me to work on. And it sort of became a running joke at Candlewick. Well, here comes Anne with Mr. McGee, into the meeting again. And, they said, well, the editorial staff would say, well, I don't know if Chris is quite right for that project. Why don't we pass? And she kept persisting, and finally, this manuscript came in about a pig named Mercy Watson, and Anne once again held up Mr. McGee and said, "How about Chris for this project?" And I think maybe she just wore him down at that point. They were just like, "Yeah, fine," and so she called me out of the blue, and she said, she introduced herself. And she said, I just got this manuscript from Kate DiCamillo, and I was wondering if you'd like to illustrate a series of 6 stories. And it was almost like a golden brick came flying out of the phone and just sort of hit me in the side of the head. And it's like, yeah, I think you get those calls like once in your lifetime. It's one of those miraculous calls. And so she sent me the story, and I laughed out loud. And that was the first story in the series called Mercy Watson to the Rescue. Have you guys seen this book, Mercy Watson books? Yeah? They're a lot of fun. She is a fantastic writer. If you're not familiar with K.T. Camillo, and if you're not, shame on you. But if you're not familiar with K.T. Camillo, she wrote Because of Winn-Dixie, The Tale of Despereaux, a bunch of incredible books. And she's written these books about this pig named Mercy Watson raised by Mr. and Mrs. Watson. And they're really funny stories. Now, one thing that Candlewick Press did that I was really impressed with is most chapter books have illustrations in black and white. And I don't know about you, but for me, that was a huge disappointment when I went from full-color picture books as a kid, and all of a sudden, there was a chapter book with maybe a black and white illustration on each chapter head. It's like, where'd the pictures go? What are all these words doing here? But Candlewick Press spent the extra money, and they decided to do full-color illustrations throughout. So I think it really fills a niche from picture books to chapter books in a really unique and special way. So that's why I think these books are so successful. There are 6 books altogether in this series. First one was called Mercy Watson to the Rescue. Second one was called Mercy Watson Goes for a Ride. Third book was called Mercy Watson Fights Crime. Fourth book was called Mercy Watson Princess in Disguise. Fifth book was called Mercy Watson Thinks Like a Pig. And the 6th book in this series, this is the last book in this series, this came out in 2009, is called Mercy Watson Something Wonky This Way Comes, which is a very silly title, but it's a very silly story. All the stories are very silly, but really, really fun to read. I was wondering how Kate DiCamillo was going to wrap up this series, because all these characters, you know, each story is sort of unique, but she did a really ingenious thing in this story. She brought all the characters from all the previous 5 books all to one place, a drive-in movie theater, and mayhem erupts, and so they're a lot of fun. Now, while I was finishing up the Mercy Watson books, I started working on another book of my own. And Candlewick Press was very interested after they had seen my illustrations for Mercy Watson. They said, if you have any of your own stories that you'd like to send us, we'd like to take a look at them. And so I had been toying with this idea of a shipwreck that happened off the coast of Maine back in the 1830s, and there was animals on the ship, and that led to my 10th book called The Circus Ship. And this is actually one of my favorite books. It is loosely based on a true story. We'll get to that in just a second, but this was my 10th book, and I was both author and illustrator at that point. Last year, my 11th book came out. I couldn't not torture Mr. McGee one more time. And so I brought him back for one more adventure called Learning to Ski with Mr. McGee. And despite the title, this is not an instructional manual. You will never learn to ski by reading this book, but it's just one of these fun, silly adventures, and it was fun to bring the character back. Although it had been 7 years since the character had appeared, so it took a little while for him to make his reappearance. And then this year, I wanted to try something a little different. I decided I'd write a fairy tale, and I wrote a book called King Hugo's Huge Ego, and we're going to read this in just a bit. Have you guys seen this book? Yeah? I want to tell you a quick, funny story, and I know I'm going to embarrass my wife who's here today. I was at a school recently, and a kid asked me a really, really great question. He said, what's your favorite title of all your books? And it was actually before King Hugo came out. But I said, by far the best title of any of my books is a book that's about to come out. It's called King Hugo's Huge Ego. And the kids kind of laughed at that. They thought that was good. I said, but it wasn't always going to be called King Hugo's Huge Ego. When I wrote this story, I usually draw sketches and I write the story and I show it to my wife, who really is sort of a good sounding board, and she checks things out and she'll make suggestions. She actually made a lot of suggestions for this story. But she read it and she liked what I had done. And then she said, "What are you going to call this book?" And I said, "I got the perfect title." She said, "Yeah?" And I said, "It's going to be called The Cocky Little King." And she looked at me like I had grown another head. And she said, "What?" I said, "I'm going to call it The Cocky Little King." I said, "I love the alliteration. I love the way it sounds. It'll be really fun." And she said, "You are not going to call it The Cocky Little King." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Do you realize what will be drawn on the cover of that book in all the libraries across the country by little boys?" And I said, "No, they're not." And she said, "It's not going to work out." And so at that point, I was kind of miffed because I thought I had a good title. And I said, "Okay, fine." I said, "Why don't you come up with a better title?" She said, "What's the king's name again?" I said, "Hugo." Without missing a beat, she said, "How about King Hugo's Huge Ego?" And I went, "That's so good." So that's how this title became King Hugo's Huge Ego and not The Cocky Little King, which would have not been so great. One more thing, and I'm surprised they have this. Candlewick has provided me with the F and G's of a book that's coming out this February. And this time, it's a book that's coming out in time for the baseball season. It's going to be called Randy Riley's Really Big Hit. This is just the pages. This isn't the bound copy. But I don't want to give it away, but it involves baseball and giant robots. And like my like my editor, when I sent the story off to my editor, she immediately put it under contract. So I called her up and I said, "Do you really like that story?" And she said, "It has baseball and giant robots." She said, "What's not to like?" And so I said, "Okay, good." So that's coming out in February. I think it comes out on Valentine's Day, actually, February 14th. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the illustration process, and because a lot of times people think that I do my illustrations on a computer. A lot of kids ask me that at school, do you work on the computer? And I say, no, I don't. All my illustrations are hand-painted. They're painted with a paint called gouache, which has kind of a funny name. It almost sounds like squash, but it's gouache, and it's a water-based paint. You mix it with water, and you can mix a lot of water with it and cover big areas, or you can mix very little water with it and make it kind of thick. But it reproduces really well, and that's what I use for my illustrations. Now, illustrating for a book is a lot different than illustrating for a magazine. A magazine, you might have 2-3 days to work on an illustration. For a book, it takes me about 7, 8, or 9 months to do a book. And so it's a lot more time-consuming process. And one of the hardest things one of the hardest things for me when I illustrate a children's book, and you'd think it would be the easiest thing in the world, is trying to get the character to look the same throughout the book. It sounds so simple, but I remember the first book, Down to the Sea with Mr. McGee, I was like, I did one illustration, and then by the time I finished the last illustration, the character had totally changed looks, and I was like, oh my gosh, he doesn't look the same. So I really, really work hard at that to try to get the character to look the same throughout the book. Another thing that I really try to do when I illustrate for books is I try to make each picture as exciting as possible. It's almost like I'm a movie director and I'm trying sort of setting up a scene. And I use a lot of different perspectives. If you know my books, you've probably seen that I use a lot of different perspectives. Sometimes things are seen from way up high, looking down on them, a bird's eye view. Sometimes you're way down low on the ground, looking up. And so I try to vary that and try to make it as interesting as possible. I figure if a kid's going to be sitting on their mom's lap, while their mom reads the words, at least give them something interesting to look at while they're sitting there, right? A couple of the things I have to keep in mind when I'm illustrating for children's books is I have to make sure that nothing really important goes through the gutter. The gutter is this section of the book. And you lose a little bit of your illustration in the gutter, about a ½ inch. So I don't want to like put somebody's face like right in the middle of the gutter because it'd be all pinched, you know, and you wouldn't see it. So I try to watch out for the gutter. And if I have to put something across the gutter, sometimes I'll paint it a little bit wider so that when you look at the book, it kind of closes in a little bit and it looks normal. Another thing I have to keep in mind when I'm illustrating for books is I have to make sure I have a space for where the words go. Because a lot of times my illustrations go across 2 pages, and when you do that, it's called a spread illustration. And a lot of times my illustration goes right off the page, and that's called a full bleed spread illustration. So I have to make sure there's a spot in the illustration where the words can be read and where they can be printed. Usually it's like a sky or a grassy lawn or something like that. One other thing I keep in mind when I'm working on illustrations for children's books is I try to keep the motion, the action going through the book the same direction as you read the book. In other words, if you're drawing a person walking, you want to see him walking from the left to the right, this way. If you do it the other way around, it sort of subconsciously halts the reader. And all of a sudden, it gives just a little bit of hitch for the reader, and you don't want that. You want the story to just flow through. That's why books like If I Built a Car, where Jack sort of imagines this dream car, if you look through the page of that book, the car is always going from the left to the right, moving through the book the same direction. So it's little tricks like that that I learned after a while that really make children's books different. Now, one of the questions I'm asked the most when I go around to schools is kids usually ask me, where do you get the ideas for your stories? And I'd like to say, you know, it just comes from one place, but that's not true. It comes from all sorts of different places. My first book, Down to the Sea with Mr. McGee, I got the idea actually from an illustration that I wanted to paint. I was working, like I told you, I was working as an editorial illustration, so I was doing magazine illustrations at the time, and occasionally an idea would pop into my head that I thought would be a good idea for an illustration. And one day I was just working on some magazine job, and all of a sudden this image of this man stuck in a boat way up in a tree kind of popped in my head, and I thought, wow, that would be fun to draw that. So I kind of took a piece of paper and I sketched it out, and I set it aside, and I went back to work, and I kind of looked over at it, and I thought, there's something kind of intriguing about that picture. And then I started asking questions. I said, okay, well, how did that guy get up in that tree? Okay, well, and how would he get down from that tree? And I sort of kind of worked the story around that illustration idea. But at the same time, I had 2 lines of type that just were running through my head day after day, these 2 little lines that I wrote, rhyming lines, and the lines were, Mr. McGee and his little dog Dee hopped in the car and drove down to the sea. And I loved the way that sounded. I could say it over and over again. I was looking at the picture and I thought, that's Mr. McGee. He's in the boat. And so that's how that story sort of started with an illustration idea, and the story was built around it, and everything sort of came together. For books like If I Built a Car, that came about a whole different way. When I was writing the Mr. McGee books, I did a lot of research, and at the time I read a lot of Dr. Seuss books. He's my hero, and so, you know, my wife and I would get in bed at night, and she'd pull out a novel, and she'd be reading a novel, and I'd pull out Thidwick, the big-hearted moose, you know, and we'd be lying in bed reading with the same intensity at much different books. And I read all these Dr. Seuss books over and over and over again just to make sure I understood how he made his rhyme so perfect. Because it's just so perfect. It's so musical. The only problem with that is occasionally a Dr. Seuss line will go into your head and you don't know it. I remember I was writing one book and I wrote this line. I thought, oh, that is perfect. And I showed it to my wife and she said, I think Dr. Seuss has used that. And I said, are you sure? And she said, yeah, why don't you check The Grinch? How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Why don't you check that again? And sure enough, it was almost the exact same line. So that's how you get those lawsuits, those plagiarism lawsuits slapped on you. So I got to watch it. So I had to kind of find my own voice. But When I was reading these Dr. Seuss books, there were two in particular that I really liked, and one was called If I Ran the Zoo and If I Ran the Circus, two of my favorites. And I really sort of learned this formula that Dr. Seuss used to write these books, where it starts off with a kid, and he sort of imagines what he'd do, and then each page sort of builds and builds and builds until you think it's like really exciting at the end, and then it goes back to the kid again, and it's all been his imagination. And I really like that sort of formula, and so I used that for the If I Built a Car. Now, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to write about for If I Built a Car, but I love cars. And so I started thinking more about cars, and I started thinking about the games I used to play with my brothers when we used to go on these long, boring car trips with my parents. They used to load us in the back of our big Ford station wagon, you know. And we used to have to make up games because we didn't have Game Boys, we didn't have DVD players or cell phones or any of that stuff. So it was all using our imagination to pass the time on these long, long trips. I'll give you an example of one of the games we used to really love. I bet some of the older people here know. On those old station wagons, they had a seat behind the back seat, which was not at the time called the third row seat. In my family, it was called the way back. And if you got to sit in the way back, it was pretty cool. Now, in our station wagon, our way back seat faced backward, right? So when we would go down the highway, my brother and I would be sitting in the way back, looking at the car behind us, coming toward us, you know. Now, if you're going down an interstate, you have the white dotted lines painted on the road, right? And if you're looking out the back window, the white dotted lines are going like this. So those white dotted lines became missiles, right? And we were in an alien spaceship, sitting in the back seat, my brother and I, commanders. And the missiles were firing out of our car. Now, the game was if the car behind us, which was an alien spaceship that needed to be destroyed, right? If that car veered out of its lane and the missile hit it, it would blow to smithereens right in front of our eyes, right? Now, my dad was a notoriously slow driver, so that happened quite often, you know, with the cars going out. And every time it's like, you know, and the people would drive by and kind of look at us like, what's wrong with those kids, you know? We're like, yeah, we got you. But they drove by. So we were doing stuff like that. And one of the other games we used to play in the car is like, what would make this car better? So one of my brothers would say, wouldn't it be cool if like there was like this machine you could push a button and get any food you wanted? We're like, yeah, that'd be cool. But we never got it. But that's what I used to formulate this story, If I Built a Car. I sort of used those games we played as a kid and that Dr. Seuss formula and made If I Built a Car. The idea for the circus ship came from an article I actually read. If you've read The Circus Ship, you know it's a bit different for me. All my books up to that point were kind of these 50s, 60s kind of retro books. And all of a sudden, I wrote a book that happened back in 1836. And that's because I read an article in Down East Magazine, which is a magazine up in the state of Maine, about a shipwreck that happened off the coast of Maine in 1836. It was traveling from St. John, New Brunswick to Portland, Maine, and it was carrying a full circus, including an elephant, 2 lions, a tiger, a wildebeest, a collection of exotic serpents and snakes and reptiles and birds and a full band and all the cages for all the animals. And right off the coast from where I live, it hit a gale and it caught on fire. It caught on fire because the captain ordered the boiler to be fired up. It was a steamship, by the way, a paddle ship. And the captain instructed the boiler to be fired up, but there was no water in the boiler. And soon the whole ship caught fire. Now, at the time, it was a really, really tragic story. It made headlines all over the country because it was probably such an unusual story. But it was also a very tragic story. It was a very sad story. There were many people lost their lives, and they think most of the animals actually perished as well. And so I was talking to some friend of mine, and I said, hey, I'm going to write a story about this ship, the Royal Tar. And he knew the ship, and he goes, You're going to turn that into a children's book? Are you crazy? And I said, well, I'm going to change things around a little bit, you know. And he said, no, you got to change it around a lot because that was really sad. So I did. I took that basic idea of a ship carrying a circus sinking off the coast of Maine and changed it into the circus ship, a book that's much more appropriate for kids. And if you've seen that book, and I saw somebody down here that looking through it, there's a page in the back of that book where it's almost like a game within the book, where all the animals are hidden in one page, and they're hiding the animals from the mean circus owner. And that was kind of a risky page. I was thinking, oh, you know, this could really backfire on me. It could be the type of thing where kids look at it once, they discover all the 50 animals, and then each time after that, when they get to that page, they're going to go, ugh, I've already found the animals. Can we just flip through it? But I've actually found it's totally the opposite, that every time kids get to that page, no matter how many times they've read that book, they have to stop and they have to find every animal in that scene. I think it's kind of like this empowering thing that I didn't really count on, but kids really, really like that picture. And my latest book, King Hugo's Huge Ego, actually came about from a couple different ideas. First of all, in the circus ship, it was the first book that I had included a villain. And in the circus ship, his name is Mr. Pain, which is sort of an apt name for him. And I had so much fun with that villain, that mean guy, that I decided to challenge myself with the next book, and I thought, I wonder if I could write a book where the main character is kind of a villain or not such a nice guy, and make it kids still like it. And so that was my first challenge. The other idea I got for this was, like I told you, I was a huge Dr. Seuss fan, still am actually, and I noticed a lot of his early books were could sort of be considered fairy tales in that they featured a boy named Bartholomew and a king named Derwin. So I decided to use that as well, and that's how this book came about. So if you don't mind, I would just like to read my latest book, and then we'll open it up the last 5 minutes for questions, all right? Okay. By the way, I wish I had an English accent because this book would sound so good with an English accent. But if I try to fake it, I'll just mess it up. I'll try to hold it up best I can. Long ago, when people spoke with words like thou and thee, there lived a king named Hugo who was only 3'3". And though this mini monarch stood no higher than an elf, his ego was enormous. He thought highly of himself. Yes, Hugo was a cocky king. I did get that word in there after all. Yes, Hugo was a cocky king, as boastful as can be. To him, no other person was as wonderful as he. He made his subjects bow to him whenever he was nigh. It pleased him to look down on them each time that he went by. And every Friday morning at precisely 10:30, his guards called all the people to the tower base, and then King Hugo cleared his throat and gave his captive congregation a lengthy talk he liked to call the speech of adoration. For hours, the poor villagers endured the boring buzz of how mighty and magnificent King Hugo thought he was. One day, King Hugo climbed aboard his coach of gleaming gold to watch the peasants bow to him as down the road he rolled. But when he turned a corner by a field of amber hay, a maiden with a heavy load was blocking up the way. The heralds blew their trumpets, then called out to the lass, "Step aside and bow your head, allow the king to pass." The girl, whose name was Tessa, said bluntly, "Go around." She didn't want to drop her load and bow down on the ground. The king began to rant and rave and spout and spit and sputter. "Roll on," he barked. And then they bumped poor Tessa to the gutter. She landed in a rivulet. Oh, what a muddy mess. But little did King Hugo know she was a sorceress, the kind with special powers like a wizard or a witch. So she cast a spell upon the king while mired in the ditch. "A pox on you, O cocky king in robes of ruby red. Let's see if all your arrogance can fit inside your head." The next day when the king awoke, he climbed down from his bed and gazed into his looking glass admiringly and said, "I do believe, dear Hugo, you're more handsome than last night." But when he put his crown back on, it felt a little tight. Then he donned his crimson robe, the one with ermine fringe. "How grand I am," the king explained, then felt a little twinge. His crown seemed even tighter now, yet Hugo didn't care. He hollered from his window to the people in the square, "Say, who's the most majestic king? 'Tis I, you must admit." But when he pulled his head back in, it almost didn't fit. Every time he claimed to be the greatest in the land, the king perceived a tingle and he felt his head expand. But he continued bragging in his overstated way, and so his head kept bloating, bulging bigger every day. By Friday, Hugo's head was huge, but still he didn't know that his self-directed compliments had caused his head to grow. His speech of adoration was scheduled as before, but when he reached the tower, he could not fit through the door. He climbed across the courtyard to climb the open stair, then called the people to the wall and gave his speech from there. "Behold, my lowly subjects, and do not doubt thine eyes, for yea, my noble noggin has increased tenfold in size. I know not how this happened, but now there's even more of your absolutely fabulous King Hugo to adore." The more he talked, the more he grew, till suddenly a squall hit the king's gigantic head and pitched him off the wall. He floated freely through the air, then landed with a thud. He bobbed and dipped and flipped and skipped and toppled through the mud. He tumbled topsy-turvy as he bounced along the lane and ended up by Tessa, who was busy stacking grain. King Hugo's head was spinning. He felt dizzy, dazed, and beat. But when he noticed Tessa, he yelled, "Get me to my feet!" Tessa wandered over. "Unbelievable," she sighed. "Did you ever stop and wonder why your head is 10 feet wide? It's your ego. It's annoying. So I cast a little spell, and every pompous thing you've said has caused your head to swell." "That's ludicrous, ridiculous, preposterous, insane. I'm humbler than anyone," the king snapped in disdain. "I'll prove it to you," she replied. "You've been this way for years. Just listen," ordered Tessa. Then she grabbed and tweaked his ears. Suddenly, a blast of hair exploded from his head, along with all the haughty things King Hugo ever said. This is like the grotesque picture in the book. King Hugo's head deflated like a giant pink balloon. And when he heard what he had said, he felt like a buffoon. Sheepishly, he said to her, "I do apologize." And then he looked at Tessa with his big, sad puppy eyes. Their glances met, and instantly, she felt her heart go zing. Could it be, deep down inside, she kind of liked the king? The king got up, he took her hand and bent down on his knee. He gazed at her with tenderness, then spoke most humbly. "Your spell has opened up my eyes. I've been unkind and rude. Please stay with me and teach me how to change my attitude." What happened next was kismet, yet truly unforeseen. He became a better man, and she became a queen. They ruled the kingdom kindly in a fair and friendly way, and everyone lived happily forever and a day. The end. Thanks. So that's my fairy tale. By the way, we have about 5 minutes left, so I think this would be a good time to open it up. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, don't be shy. Oh, there's a microphone right here if anybody wants to ask me a question. And there's one over there, too. Do you have a question? Okay, speak right into the microphone. You can pull it right down. There you go.
Where did you get your ideas to draw pictures?
Where did I get my ideas to draw pictures? Well, I like to draw things that are kind of interesting. And I also like to draw things like robots and monsters and stuff like that. So, but I get my ideas for my pictures from my story. So I write the story first, and then I draw the pictures for the story. Is that what you're asking? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Where did you get your ideas for the Mercy Watson series?
The Mercy Watson series? Well, the illustrations for the Mercy Watson series were really just directly from Kate DiCamillo's stories. So she wrote these great stories, and I just had to, if like the pig flies out of the car, oh, that would be fun to draw. So you draw the pig flying out of the car. So I just really just illustrated her stories or her words. But I also came up with the way the characters looked, and that was really fun in that project. That was an excellent question. Good.
What's your favorite book?
What's my favorite book that I've written? That I've illustrated? Written and illustrated? Okay. That's a really good question, and a lot of kids ask me. In fact, that's probably the question I get asked more than anything. And I'm actually going to steal my answer from somebody else, because I was with Kate DiCamillo once at a book signing, and somebody asked her the same question, and her answer was so good. She said, well, it's really hard for me to answer that, and I feel the same way about my books. She said, but it's almost like asking a parent, who's your favorite kid? A parent would never say, well, I like Susie, but I don't like Bobby anymore. They would never say that because they like them for different reasons, but they love all of them. And even though, I like the illustrations maybe better in one book or the story maybe better, a little bit better in another book, I like them all for the reason just because it spent so long creating them. But that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. Anybody else? Go ahead. Is that on? I don't think that's on.
I think he's clicked it.
Oh,
Are you
there you go. It's on now.
Are you ever going to get? Are you ever gonna do it?
That's.
Are you ever gonna do a lobster book?
Am I ever going to do a lobster book?
Lobster or monster?
Lobster.
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 Lobster. Like a lobster? Like this lobster? Oh, okay. I hadn't planned on it. Do you think I should do a lobster book? Yeah? Like a super lobster? Super alien lobster? What?
I would say a lobster that is trying to get away from a lobster trap.
Oh, a lobster that tries to get away from a lobster trap. That's a good idea. Do I have to send you the royalties if I could? Like, I might. You never know. Yep, go ahead.
I like to express my ideas, but I'm not a really good drawer.
Yep.
Do you have any tips to maybe improve on your drawings, or at least make them so that other people can visibly understand what they look like and what they're supposed to mean?
That's an excellent question. Everybody hear that question? That was a really good question. Yeah, I have some tips. I would encourage you if you want. Do you want to become an artist, but you're just kind of struggling at it? You just want to draw better?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's just
Well, the only advice I would give you, and it's kind of a cop-out, but I would just say practice and just draw everything. And it really helps if you draw things that you're looking at, Sometimes you draw things out of your imagination, and that's cool too. But if you look at like take your sneaker and draw your sneaker, which is really kind of hard, but you'll get better if you practice over and over again. It's just a matter of drawing. See, I've been drawing since I was like 4 years old, so I just draw all the time, and the more I draw, the better I get. So that's a good question. Couple more questions, and I think we're about 2 minutes left. Go ahead.
Have you ever drawn a narwhal?
Have I ever drawn a narwhal? What'd you say?
It's half unicorn, half whale.
I thought that's what you said. Have I ever drawn a narwhal?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That is the first time anybody's ever asked me that question. Have I ever drawn a narwhal? I think I did actually once draw a narwhal when I was working editorial illustration for kids' books. I think I drew a narwhal once. But they had these cool sort of spiral horns, right? Yeah. Should I write a book about? How about a book about a lobster and a narwhal? There we go. How about over here now? Yeah.
In Mercy Watson, a princess in disguise, why is she dressed up in like a princess costume?
That's what Mr. and Mrs. Watson decided to dress her up as when they took her trick-or-treating. Remember they tried all the other different costumes? They tried a robot and a pirate and a witch, and they thought she should be a princess.
I think she would look at it as bacon, because pigs are made into bacon.
Did I look at bacon to draw Mercy? Is that what you say?
Yeah.
No, but I ate a lot of bacon. I ate a lot of bacon and I ate a lot of hot buttered toast when I was doing that book. I drew bacon in a dress. I like that. Go ahead. Have I ever drawn a horse? There are two things I'm going to confess right now. There are two things I cannot draw, and that's horses and cats. Can you teach me sometime? Okay. So I don't draw horses very often. Yes?
Do you have a dog?
I do. I have a dog at home. She's a 10-year-old yellow lab named Pearl. Yeah. She's probably sleeping right now. And one more.
What's your question?
You have the question?
How do you draw make the pictures for Mercy Watson books?
How did I make the pictures in Mercy Watson? What? How did I make the pictures? They were just painted. They were painted pictures using that funny-sounding paint, gouache. And I just sketched the pictures all out first and then painted the pictures. But I got to create how the characters looked, so that was the really fun part. And Mr. and Mrs. Watson, if you notice, they kind of look like pigs, too, a little bit. So I thought that would be really cool, you know. Yes? This will have to be the last question. I didn't hear that.
Do you ever use the computer?
Do I ever use a computer? The computer to me is just a really expensive typewriter. Yeah. I use it for eBay. And Google Images. Those are really helpful. Thank you so much for coming today. It was great to be here. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.